soul so weary, when troubles come and my heart burdened be, then I am still and wait here in the silence until you come and sit a while with me.
Today, we have borne in our arms and on our shoulders a new monument to our nation's capital. It is not made of granite or steel and was not built by stonecutters and engineers. Our monument is sewn of fabric and thread and was created in homes across America and wherever friends and family gathered to remember their loved ones lost to AIDS. We bring a quilt. We bring it here today with shocked sorrow at its vastness and the speed with which its acreage redoubles. We bring it to this place at this time, accompanied by our deepest hope, that the leaders of our country will see the evidence of our labor and our love, and that they will be moved. We bring a quilt. We have carried this quilt to every part of our country, and we have seen that the American people know how to defeat AIDS. We bring a quilt. It grows day by day and night by night, and yet its expanse does not begin to cover our grief, nor does its weight outweigh the heaviness within our hearts. The American people are ready and able to defeat AIDS. It will require us to understand as a nation that there is no conflict between the compassionate response and the scientific response, no conflict between love and logic. We bring a quilt. We hope it will help people to remember. We hope it will teach our leaders to act. We bring a quilt.
You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. Raise me up to more than I can be.
Wasn't that wonderful? I think it's very moving, and I want to thank Gary Bellard, who works with us in putting this together. So, welcome. We're thrilled that you're here tonight. We really are. This is a very special evening for us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Hugh Beswick. I'm the CEO of the World AIDS Museum and Educational Center, and I'm really pleased that we have such a good turnout. I'd like to say a little bit about our mission to begin. The museum is the only museum in the world that's dedicated exclusively to HIV and AIDS, and our mission is built around eliminating the stigma. We believe that AIDS is probably the most stigmatized disease that's ever been, and Steve Stegan, our founder, always says that, and I want to get this right, we say that the stigma itself is almost as deadly as the disease, and that's become obvious to all of us. And we implement the mission by documenting the history of the disease in an accurate way, by remembering those who suffer and suffered, and then by educating, by enlightening, and by empowering those who survive, and empowering the public in general. So that's our mission. This evening is part of our history series. We do 2 or 3 of these a year, and we really we're so pleased to be able to bring in icons. It's a wonderful opportunity to hear from the people who actually shaped the story of HIV and AIDS in America and around the world. It's my honor, our honor, to welcome Cleve Jones tonight. Everybody here, I'm sure, knows that Cleve initiated the Quilt Project in 1987. This is the 30th anniversary. And he also wrote the book, When We Rise, My Life in the Movement, which was the inspiration for the miniseries, the ABC miniseries, which was so wonderful that most people saw this year. So anyway, at this point, I'm thrilled to introduce An Evening with Cleve Jones.
Hello, how are you doing? In my union, this is how we do it. I want to thank you all very much for showing up on such a wet night. I got off the plane and I said to the driver, "Is it going to rain?" He said, No, it's not going to rain. I want to thank the AIDS World Museum and Education Center for inviting me here, and for this wonderful church for hosting it. I know it's my kind of church because they've got condoms in the men's room. A little different from the Quaker meeting I grew up in Phoenix. So there's a lot to talk about, but I was listening. I didn't get to meet her. Who's the woman who was speaking just before me? Yes. So, yes, we have to be together. We have to stay together. And it's so important now, and it was always important, but it's more important than ever. And I want to just preface my little story by saying, we're talking about the quilt, 30 years. Can you believe it, Brad? It's amazing. It's appalling. But it's not just about the past. It's very much about the present and the future. And you all live in a state with one of the highest HIV infection rates in the nation. You also live in a state that has one of the worst examples of racial disparity in access to treatment and care. So it's not just about the past, it's not just about today, it's what you are going to do and the commitment you all need to make to continue this fight and to care for our young people, gay and straight, young, all of us, black and brown and white, we're all in this together. So I very much appreciated what you said. So my story begins when I was a little baby homosexual and my family moved to Phoenix, Arizona. Awful place, still pretty awful. And I went to high school there, and by middle school, they were already calling me names that I didn't even really understand, but it seemed like everybody kind of knew what I was before I even knew what I was. And I'd hoped that when we moved to Phoenix and I started high school there, that I would get a kind of a new beginning, and of course, it wasn't to be, and the abuse started almost immediately. The most dangerous place for me was gym class. PE was just a nightmare, and our family physician, I think, had an inkling of what was going on, and we decided that I had a lung disease and I couldn't go to gym class. So I took a note to the principal, and so every day during gym class, I would avoid the bullies, and I would hide out in the school library and read magazines. And it was there in 1971, December, that I read the year in review issue of Life magazine. And I know there's a lot of old-timers here. You all remember we all loved Life magazine, and it's a big magazine, so I could hide behind it, and all those photographs. And it was there one day, hiding out, pretending to be sick. I'm so sick, I can't go to gym class. And I opened that magazine, and I saw the headline that said, "Homosexuals in Revolt." And there were these photographs of these hot young guys with long hair fighting the police in Greenwich Village. I turned the next page, there's a photograph of Troy Perry, the founder of the Metropolitan Community Churches. There were stories from San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and even one from Tempe, Arizona, where Arizona State is, where my parents were teaching. And in that moment, I discovered for the first time that I was not alone, that I was part of a community, and that there was a movement for people like me. And that was an astonishing revelation, because all I had managed to learn about what it meant to be homosexual was that it was sinful, and that it was sick, and that it was criminal. And I didn't want to be that kind of person. So when I was 15 years old, I thought my life was over before it had even begun. I begin my book and end it with the statement that the movement saved my life. That's not hyperbole, that's not a slogan, that's not rhetoric, that's the fact. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the movement. That same year that I saw that magazine, both my parents had medical procedures. My dad had a spinal issue, my mom had her gallbladder out, and the house was full of pills. There were pain pills and sleeping pills and muscle relaxers. And I started stealing them one by one, very carefully, so I wouldn't get caught. Because I knew sooner or later people were going to figure out what I was. And there would be only one way out. And we like to think, we've made so much progress. But right now, certainly just within miles of us, there are queer and trans kids right now who are planning to take their own lives. But then I read Life magazine, and I took those pills and I flushed them down the toilet, and I got the hell out of Phoenix, and I hitchhiked to San Francisco. So I get to San Francisco, I land on Polk Street, I'm in the Tenderloin, this idiot white boy from Scottsdale, and I had no money, I had no skills, no education, long hair, and it was pretty grim. And there were nights then it was really frightening. And I am old now, but I remember quite clearly what it's like to be homeless, what it's like to be hungry, what it's like to sleep on park benches, what it's like to have to do things you don't want to do just to survive and get a meal in your belly and a roof over your head. There were nights when all I could do was cry, but also in the middle of that, I met some of the most amazing people. The first lesbian activists I met were Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, the founders of the Daughters of Bilitis. I was still 17 when I met them. They were fire-breathing lesbian feminists, and they just, I thought they were extraordinary. I told Phyllis that she reminded me of my mother. Not smart. I don't think I can repeat in a church what she said to me. But she remembered it 3 weeks ago when I saw her eating dinner on Market Street and stopped to say hello to her. She's still alive. Del, of course, we lost a few years ago. I met Jose Sarria. I met Jim Foster, the first openly gay person to address a political convention when he spoke at the Democratic National Convention in 1972. And of course, I met Harvey Milk. You know, I want you to know that Harvey Milk was not a genius. He was not a saint. And now that he's become this legend, this mythic figure, and portrayed by Sean Penn, I think it's really important that we understand that he was, in most regards, an ordinary person. And in his own life, he experienced all of the setbacks and humiliations and frustrations and defeats and even tragedies that most of us have to endure in our lifetime. I've been privileged in my life to meet some amazing heroes. I got to spend a Sunday afternoon with Rosa Parks. I got to march with Cesar Chavez. I even got a 20-minute conversation with Nelson Mandela. These, to me, you know, they're such heroes, but they're ordinary men and women, and their achievements are ones that all of us can aspire to in our own lives. So don't put them on some pedestal and elevate them to something that's impossible for other people to achieve. Every one of us has those kinds of gifts if we just see them. Harvey bribed me to go back to school. He said if I would go back to school, he would give me an internship after he got elected. Now, he'd already lost 3 elections, and I told him, you know, this doesn't sound very promising. But okay, and he made me cut my hair, and I'll just say it, stop selling weed on the corner. And I went to City College at first, which back then was completely free. And thanks to the inspiration of a certain candidate for president last year, our City College is again free in San Francisco for any kid that wants to go to school. I had it in my head that I was going to be a famous film director, and back then we had Super 8 cameras. I see a lot of older people here remember what a Super 8 camera was. And I made my very first film, and I took it to Harvey and I showed it to him. He was getting ready to have a film festival in his little camera store. He and Scott Smith had put up a big sheet on the wall in the back room, and they'd invited people to contribute films. That continues today. It's now the San Francisco International Gay and Lesbian Film Festival and draws tens of thousands of people every year. So I made my little film and I showed it to Harvey, and he took me aside and he said, "I'm sorry, but you have no talent at all. You need to change your major." So I enrolled in the political science department at San Francisco State, and Harvey won his election and took me with him to work as an intern. And it was just the coolest gig for a 22-year-old kid. You know, I got to work on putting in a stop sign at the dangerous intersection and helping to find funding to support the Latino community mental health services in the Mission District. And I got to work on the first gay rights ordinance. It was just the most amazing thing. He was hilarious to work with. I was one of many young people who was fortunate enough to be mentored by him, and I needed that because my own father still wasn't speaking to me. He had made it quite clear that I was not welcome in the home unless I agreed to go into therapy, and that, I don't know how many of you saw the ABC miniseries. Did you see, how many of you saw it? So that scene where young Cleve goes to his psychologist father's library and learns about prefrontal lobotomies and electroconvulsive shock treatment, you know, that was true. And that was why I made sure he didn't find out until I was 18 and had no legal authority to have me committed, because he would have done that. So I needed that father figure desperately, and Harvey was the most appropriate father figure. And I was, as I said, one of many young people, boys and girls, that he encouraged. I got to work with him for 11 months. And then on November 27th, 1978, I went to work early because it was Thanksgiving coming up, and Harvey had two paid assistants. One was Ann Cronenberg, the other was Dick Pavich. Dick passed away a long time ago from AIDS, but Annie is still alive and still working for the city. She'd gone up to Seattle to be with her mom and dad for the Thanksgiving holidays. So I knew Harvey was getting slammed with lots of stuff. There was a controversy because another supervisor, a guy named Dan White, had resigned in a fit of temper and was now asking the mayor, George Moscone, to give him his job back. So I got in early and hoping to impress Harvey, and instead he was annoyed with me because I'd left a file that he wanted back in my apartment on Castro Street. He was kind of curt and told me to go home and get the file, and then he saw on my face, you know, that I was crushed, and he said, I'm sorry, I'm under a lot of pressure, but go back to Castro Street, get that file, and Local 2 from Unite Here, the Hospitality Workers Union, is picketing the Patio Cafe. So go join the picket line. Guess where they're from. And so I got back to Castro Street. It was a beautiful day, and I retrieved the file, and then I walked down and I did a few rounds on the picket line, and then the 24 Divisadero pulled up at the corner of Castro and 18th Street, and some woman I didn't know opened the window and screamed at me out the window, "Cleve, somebody shot the mayor." I couldn't imagine who would want to kill George Moscone. He was such a charismatic, warm, generous man. He and Harvey had envisioned the Progressive Coalition. The idea that if we could bring the racial and ethnic communities together with organized labor, with feminists, with environmentalists, and the LGBT community, that we could take power and that we could transform the city and defend the most vulnerable among us. And he did it with such grace and dignity and good humor, and the thought of anybody wanting to kill him was just mind-boggling to me. And I got in the taxi and I got down to City Hall as fast as I could, and I went in the western entrance on Van Ness. The mayor's office is on the eastern side of the building. The Board of Supervisors' offices are on the western side of the building. And I ran in and I ran up the grand staircase, seeing all of the cops over by the mayor's office. And I got up to the Board of Supervisors' chambers, and I ran through and I had a key to the passageway that led to the individual supervisors' offices. And I opened the door and I raced through, calling out, "Harvey, where are you? Where are you?" And I turned the corner and I saw his feet sticking out into the hallway. And I knew it was him because he only had one pair of dress shoes, a pair of second-hand wingtips that he bought at the thrift store. And I remember so vividly, still all these years later, creeping up and peering around the doorway as a cop on his knees turned Harvey's body over. I had never seen a dead person before. I have seen many since. But the horror of that realization of what bullets do to flesh and bone and brain is still with me after all these years. And I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then when I finally understood what I was looking at, the first thing I thought was, it's all over now. It's all over. We've lost our leader. I've lost my mentor. He was like my dad. It's all over now. We were kind of trapped in his office while the police bundled up the bodies. And I sat in Harvey's chair while we played the audio tape that he'd left with the instructions that it should only be played in the event of his assassination. I used to make fun of him. I said, Harvey, why'd you make that tape? You're not important enough to get assassinated. You're not Dr. King. You're not Bobby Kennedy. Nobody's going to kill you, Harvey. And a very strange thing to be sitting in his office, in his chair, listening to his voice, and his body's right there in the corridor. And all I could think was, it's over. It's over. It's all over. And then the sun went down, and people began to gather on Castro Street. And we were gay and straight and young and old and black and brown and white and immigrant and native born. And we lit our candles. First there were hundreds, then there were thousands, then there were tens of thousands. And we marched in silence down Market Street and filled Civic Center Plaza. And I remember standing in that enormous, beautiful lake of candlelight and knowing I was wrong. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. As you know, I imagine, Dan White, I usually say the appropriately named Dan White, went on trial, and somehow in San Francisco they managed to impanel a jury that was all white and all heterosexual. That's quite an accomplishment in San Francisco. Well done, Mr. DA. And when news of the verdict finally came down on May 21st, 1979, the day before Harvey's birthday, we marched on City Hall again, but we weren't carrying candles, and we burned all of the police cars in Civic Center and stormed City Hall. It was one of the most violent uprisings in the history of our movement. When the dust settled and the smoke cleared, and I don't offer this as career guidance for any young people who might be here, but after the riot, I got offered this great job, and I went to work for the Speaker of the California State Assembly, a man named Leo T. McCarthy, as a consultant to the Democratic Caucus of the California State Assembly. When I got there, he assigned me to the Assembly Health Committee. I knew nothing about public health issues, so I quickly subscribed to every conceivable journal, out of the Harvard Medical School, all sorts of periodicals dealing with a whole range of public health issues. The committee was, everything from asbestosis to Alzheimer's, anything you could think of under that large umbrella of public health. And so it was there in June of 1981 that I read in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report out of the Centers for Disease Control, the first 4 paragraphs that were published about the disease we now call HIV/AIDS. And I remember clipping that out and putting it on my bulletin board. And I wrote in the caption, "Just when things were looking up." That was June of 1981. By November of 1985, almost everyone I knew was dead or dying or caring for someone who was dying. It took everything. It was like a fire or an avalanche. It was so horrible, and it was made even worse by the fact that the rest of the world really didn't seem to care a bit. The Republicans had a convention, I think it was in Long Beach that year, and they had bumper stickers that said, "AIDS, it's killing all the right people." And who were those people? Well, the first people we knew were getting AIDS were gay people. The second people we knew were getting AIDS were black people. All the right people. IV drug users. Don't really care about them much, do we? Haitian immigrants. Sex workers. And I was getting angrier and angrier. And that November of 1985, a few days before the annual Candlelight March that we do every year on November 27th to remember Harvey and George. And Brad, I know you've heard this story a few hundred times. Thanks for being here. I was walking up and down Castro Street with my staple gun and my mimeographed posters. Remember mimeograph machines? Remember how stoned you got from those fumes? Like, oh my God, it's like printing with poppers. So I'm walking up and down Castro Street with my friend Joseph, and we're just putting up the flyers and telling everybody we knew, don't forget, we're marching again for Harvey and George, bring your candles. And we stopped at Marcello's Pizza Parlor. It's there at Castro and Market, it's still there. Got a Coke and a slice of pizza, and we're outside leaning against the newspaper racks, and we see the headline in the San Francisco Chronicle, 1,000 dead of AIDS in San Francisco. And I don't know how many of you have been to the corner of Castro and Market Street, quite a few of you, I imagine, and you know, it looks the same now as it did then. Beautiful restored Victorians, cafes, restaurants, clubs, you hear music and laughter and smell coffee and food and lately cannabis, and there's no indication that you're standing at this epicenter. But I knew that if those first 1,000 to die, almost every one of them lived and died within 6 blocks of where I was standing. And there was no evidence. And I was getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And I remember saying to my friend Joseph, you know, if this wasn't beautiful Victorians and these nice clubs, maybe if we had a bulldozer and knocked these down, maybe if this was a field with 1,000 corpses rotting in the sun, then people would see it and they would understand. And if they were human beings, they would be compelled to respond. And there was no response. And we had a president at the time who has since been elevated to sainthood in some quarters, who did not utter the word AIDS in public until more Americans had died of AIDS than died in the entire Vietnam War. And I was furious. And I didn't know what to do, and no one knew what to do. But a few nights later, as people began to gather with their candles for Harvey Milk and George Moscone, I had Harvey's old bullhorn. And I had stacks of poster board and magic markers, and I talked to the crowd and I said, you know, we've lost a lot more than Harvey and George. Please write the names of your friends, your lovers, your neighbors who have died. And at first people were afraid to do it because the stigma associated with the disease was so overwhelming. You know, people didn't get obituaries, they didn't get memorial services, they just got buried or burned, and their family would swoop in and sell the furniture and throw the lover out in the street. Ken Jones's story in the miniseries, that's true. Been with his partner for a decade, cared for him until he died, and then the family that hadn't spoken to him in years and years shows up and throws Ken out in the street. There's a lot to be angry about. There's a lot to remember about what happened then. People began to write the names, and we walked with our placards down Market Street, as we always do every year, and our candles. And we left our candles on the steps of City Hall, and then we went another 2 blocks to the old Federal Building, which housed at that time Reagan's Health and Human Services for the West Coast. We'd hidden extension ladders around the corner, and we got a nun with a beard on a bicycle to distract the police over here. And we broke through the cops' lines, and we took our ladders, and we climbed up with big rolls of tape on our wrist, and we covered that gray stone facade with these placards with these names. And it was a cold, misty, drizzly night. There were no speeches, no music, just hundreds, maybe a few thousand people standing in the cold, looking at the names on that wall. And I walked through the crowd, and I listened to what people were whispering to each other, and they were saying, I didn't know he died. Nobody told me. We were from the same hometown. I wish I'd known. I wish I could have done something. And you know, you could just feel, and I know many of you remember this so vividly, that yearning need to find a way to grieve together for our friends who had died so horribly and so young, and also to try to find a way to warn the world of what was coming. I flunked biology, but I'm not stupid. There's no such thing as a gay virus. This isn't God's wrath. This is a pandemic. And I looked over the heads of everybody at that patchwork of names on the wall, and I thought it looked like some kind of strange quilt. And I thought of my great-grandma, Irene Rupert, and the quilt that she sewed in 1952 in Bee Ridge, Indiana. When my grandmother gave it to me, she said, "Look, your great-grandmother made this for you. She loved you so much, she made it before you were even born." And it's still on my bed at home. It was such a warm, comforting, middle-class, traditional family values kind of symbol. And to me, it evoked Conestoga wagons crossing the prairie. I thought of those pioneer women making camp and sewing together bits of discarded fabric to make something beautiful and warm and comforting. I thought of African slaves in the South, hoarding remnants of fabric, creating great works of art from cast-off discards from the big house. It just seemed like such an American folk art. And then I imagined the National Mall in Washington covered from one end to the other with fabric bearing the names of all of our friends and lovers and neighbors who had died of AIDS. Everybody told me it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of. "Oh, you can't do that. That's too complicated. Sounds morbid to me." "I don't know, Cleve. Sounds very expensive. Does anybody even sew anymore? I don't think so." Isn't that the truth, though? It's like every time somebody wants to step up and do something, the chorus arises, "No, you may not do that." That's so stupid. And so, particularly to any young people that are here, I just was speaking last night to an amazing crowd of young people at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green. And I told them, when you get that idea, when you get that passion, when you've got it in your heart, you know you have to do this. And all your friends say, "Oh, that totally sucks." Just tell them, and do it anyway, Just do it anyway. I still can't sew. But it was just extraordinary. Just absolutely extraordinary. And the older I get and the more time that's passed between it, and it's hard to imagine that it's 30 years now. But there's people in this room who were part of that very beginning of the quilt, and thousands upon thousands of people created the quilt panels. Tens of thousands volunteered to organize the displays. Millions of people walked through the fabric walkways, and hundreds of millions of people received the quilt's message through the media. It is very difficult for me to remember that period, partly because so many of our people died, and that you lost your friends, and then you made new friends, and then they died, and you made new friends, and then they died. And I didn't expect to survive, and I really thought it was over. I couldn't see how we could move forward, how the people we now call LGBTQ, I didn't see how we could survive AIDS. And one more time in my life, I thought, well, it's over now. Being gay will now forever be associated with disease and death. And we are being decimated, and our leaders are being taken from us. How can we survive? And then I got sick. And then I got really sick. And I got pneumocystis pneumonia, and I thought, well, now it's over for sure. And then I think Jeff and I were in the same trial, weren't we? The first cocktail, a slander against vodka tonics. And I got better. I didn't die. And as my other friends began to get better, we would discuss this and we would say, maybe we're not going to die. Wow, maybe we won't. Maybe we're going to live, but we'll never be happy again. I couldn't see how there would ever be joy in my life again. But month by month, I got stronger and I got healthier. I went to work for a union called Unite Here. We represent hospitality workers throughout the United States and Canada. It's a fighting, militant union. We represent, think of the women that clean the rooms in the big hotels, think of the valet parkers, think of the cooks and the room service people, and the women running the laundry. Most of our members are women, most of our members are immigrants, women of color. I loved the work. It made me feel grounded in reality. People who are struggling for tangible gains, and we win victories, and the people that work in those hotels, they go home with more money in their pockets. They work in safer working conditions. Access to better health care, they can put their kids through college, and they're treated with more respect on the job. And when we talk to our members, that's the first thing they tell you. They want the respect. Union, fights for LGBT, and just in the last 2 weeks has expanded we run a health plan. We've just expanded the health plan to include full coverage for transgender workers. I felt like everything I had done, and the early days of gay liberation, I felt like all of that was very quickly receding, back into history. And I would go to college campuses and I would speak to young people and I'd say, how many of you know who Harvey Milk was? And nobody knew. They'd already forgotten him. And then I met a young man named Dustin Lance Black. And he wrote a screenplay, and I took him to meet Gus Van Sant, and we made a little movie called Milk. And it was the most extraordinary adventure. I remember reading the first draft of the screenplay at Lance's little house in Hollywood, and I'd read maybe 30 or 40 scripts over the decades, and they all were awful. And this one wasn't. And I just reading the very first rough draft, I could hear Harvey's voice saying those words. And I took him up to meet Gus, and I was nervous because Dustin Lance Black is not shy anymore, but he was very shy then. And Gus is kind of a shy guy. And as we're driving up there, I was thinking, well, how do I get them to talk about it? But I still smoked then, and I just sat back and smoked a cigarette and listened to these two very gay men from very different generations, the Academy Awards winning. It was amazing. And then, suddenly, it was like I was being exhumed. And all these young people are calling me and reaching out to me, and it was my old bones were being dusted off, and they were saying, well, how did you do it back then before the internet? And I got to work with young people. I moved to Palm Springs for a while, and suddenly my house in Palm Springs was filled with young people planning the National Equality March for 2009. We went there. We wanted to push the Democrats. We wanted to push the new president. And that November that the film came out, I still look back as one of those milestone months, because in that November, we showed, or forgive me, Barack Obama showed us that change is possible in our country. And I got to witness something I never thought I would live long enough to see. A black man in the White House. And on that same election night, the voters of California said no to marriage equality. And thousands and then tens of thousands of young people poured out into the street, gay and straight, young and old, black and brown and white, immigrant and native born, and we marched and they marched and they marched and they kept marching. We decided to go to the Supreme Court. Every single national LGBT organization and the ACLU said, don't you dare. This is not the time to go to the Supreme Court. You are going to destroy the movement. You are going to set us back 50 years. Wait for a better court. So again, sometimes you got to say, and do it anyway. And Edie Windsor had the same experience on the East Coast. All those organizations turned her down. And she said, and we won. We won this amazing victory. So, last November, I'm sitting at home. My boyfriend was in Washington, D.C. on business. He's a lot younger than me. We text a lot. And I'm watching the news. Like all of you, I'm glued to the screen with that horrible knot in my stomach. And y'all, Florida went down. And I texted him, "It's over now." And he texts back, "No, honey, don't give up. It's not over. It's not over yet." And I don't remember which state was next, but then came Pennsylvania. And I knew we were done. I was too angry to text anymore, so I called my boyfriend up and I started ranting at him. And, we're going to lose everything. They're going to build camps for us. We're going to be put in prison, And he listened patiently for a little while, and then he cut me off. He said, "Honey, you just went from 0 to Auschwitz in 30 seconds. Are you alone in the apartment?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, what are you doing there? Get down to Castro Street." So I went down to the street, and soon there were dozens, and then there were hundreds, and then there were thousands, and then there were tens of thousands, and we were gay and straight and young and old and black and brown and white and immigrant and native born, and we marched and we marched and we haven't stopped marching since. And I want you to know that I am 63 years old. I am healthy. I am happy. I am in love, and I am still fighting. Bring it on, Trump. Bring it on. Si se puede.